It's amazing how many stories a single location can tell. Not only that, but a single story can hold many lessons waiting to be learned. So what does it mean when different entities with different motives collide in one place? Well, then you get a turbulent location that has trouble settling down despite the desire for peace and quiet. You end up with a place like Brayflox's Longstop. Our story actually begins long before the goblins of Lenosha started to settle down deep within the vibrant forest called the Raincatcher Gully. Located near the Isle of Vilbran's eastern coast, this forest is one of the more colorful and life-filled parts of the island thanks to a variety of factors, making it a wonderful home for all sorts of life. But this abundance of game, both big and small, did not escape the eyes of a spiteful dragon. Indeed, before Brayflox even began building her tiny forest empire, a dragon had taken roost nearby, and its name was Ayatar. Ayatar was a member of Nidhogg's brood, and as such had no love in its heart for the mortal races, observing them all through the same spiteful lens as their sire. While many would wonder why Ayatar was so far south of Dravania, it was for a good reason. Apparently, the Green Dragon had been engaged by Ishgard's skillful dragoons during a raid. This battle did not go in Ayatar's favor, as they would be dealt a deep and painful blow. Instead of regrouping with their brothers and sisters, Ayatar flew south, far from the fields of Kurthus, so they might not only regain their strength, but return even more powerful. The dragon chose to make a large cave in the forests of Vilbrand its temporary home, and that's when it began to bide its time. Ayatar wasn't avoiding their responsibilities, the opposite actually. Often would the dragon fly over the forest and hunt down a variety of poisonous plants and animals, only to feast on them. Ayatar was a dragon that specialized in toxic spells, venomous bites, and poisonous breath attacks. So devouring a variety of toxic plants and animals would only serve to strengthen them, as the aether that made up that entity's poison would be added to Ayatar's natural supply. The dragon would continue doing this for a while, feasting on the forest and then resting in its cave to steadily improve its strength and recover from its wounds. But Ayatar wouldn't be alone for too terribly long, as a charismatic goblin would be found adventuring through the Raincatcher Gully. Her name was Brayflox Altox, and she was looking to settle a section of the forest for herself and like-minded Gobbiken. Having been a member of a famous adventuring group called the Company of Heroes, Brayflox had all the reputation she needed to settle somewhere in the forest. At first, everything was going very well. The initial stages of the settlement were getting along just fine, but eventually Ayatar would rouse from their slumber and attempt to resume their hunting, only to find that the goblins had moved in almost on top of them. This invasion of their hunting grounds threw Ayatar into a rage, making use of the goblins as sport for when they would soon return to Ishgard and spew forth toxic clouds upon unsuspecting knights. It didn't take long for Brayflox to hear about this development and immediately petitioned some of her oldest friends for aid. Those friends would send help in the form of reliable and trustworthy adventurers, who Brayflox would eagerly put to work. Meanwhile, Ayatar's rampage through the forest had worked up all sorts of animals and beasts, making the Longstop actively hostile. The adventurers were helped through the forest by Brayflox, as they attempted to put down any aggressive monsters that were threatening the goblins and their modest settlement. But Ayatar was not afraid to make their presence known, as they would attempt to ambush the adventurers during their battles. Though eventually, Ayatar would be pushed back to the cave they had made their home, and it was here that the adventurers would finally do battle with and eventually slay the toxic dragon, once and for all. Ayatar would never rejoin Nidhogg's horde, and their poisonous breath would never harm Ishgard again. Brayflox Altox was understandably elated to see that the evil dragon was dead, and that the more ferocious monsters of the forest had been slain. This meant that the goblins could pick up the pieces of their settlement and resume building their new lives within the dense forest of Raincatcher's Gully. But this wouldn't mark the end of trouble for the goblins living within the Longstop, not by a long shot. as Brayflox would eventually do something reckless and bring a host of danger right back to her people. To understand why and how such a thing could happen, we need to understand that there is a group of goblins that believe themselves the elite of the elite. That their knowledge, technology, and foresight is no less than that of old Charlian. These goblins are called the Illuminati, but are more casually referred to as the Blue Hand. Lately, they're more commonly seen operating out of the Dravanian hinterlands, as they've invested a lot of time and resources into reverse engineering Charlian tech, as well as appropriating parts of the abandoned settlement for their own personal use. If one thing is for certain, their zealous desire to gain new knowledge certainly matches that of Charlian, but such knowledge is only ever used to serve them. As such, in Brayflox's own words, she didn't steal from the Illuminati as much as she was freeing the knowledge they were hoarding for themselves. But as she retreated to the Longstop, she would bring the wrath of the Illuminati with her, as the thing she stole was a priceless cheese recipe. That's right, a small-scale war was started in the Raincatcher Gully over the creation and distribution of fromage. For better or worse, Gabi cheese is just as famous as it is infamous, so taking the knowledge of something so precious to their culture was seen as nothing less than an act of war. Which was fitting, because war is exactly what Brayflox had brought to the Longstop. For stealing the recipe of top-secret Gabi cheese, the full force of the Illuminati was brought upon the Longstop. They would do anything to recover the recipe. Anything. Members of the goblin settlement living in the forest were jailed and put under intense interrogation to try and get the location of Brayflox as well as that of the cheese recipe. But thankfully for Brayflox, her friends would never abandon her, as when she asked for help once more, she was sent the self-same adventurers that had helped her previously. Knowing full well what they were capable of, Brayflox proudly led them back into the Longstop to put an end to the Illuminati's dangerous infiltration. Within the forest, there were now countless signs of conflict, as the Illuminati had destroyed much of what the forest goblins had built in the time since Ayatar's death. In fact, the Illuminati were so aggressive that the moment these adventurers were spotted, they were immediately fired upon. This killed any chance of peaceful negotiation, as the adventurers would carve a path through the Illuminati and eventually make their way back to the heart of the settlement. Along the way, the captured goblins would be freed, and many members of the Illuminati would fall to the adventuring party. The leaders of the Illuminati were found within the same cave that Ayatar once used as their home, and it was here that the adventurers would need to destroy their strongest siege weapon, a device called the God Machine G6. This weapon packed a dangerous punch in the form of potent explosives. But it was only a matter of time until this mobile weapon would struggle to keep up with its quick-footed opponents, and as such would be thoroughly destroyed and dismantled. With the G6 out of commission, and many of the Illuminati either defeated or fled, the Longstop was once more brought back to a place of peace. But only time will tell if Brayflox plans on keeping it that way for long. This is definitely one of the more interesting stories that the Isle of Vilbrin has to offer. It's not entirely unheard of for goblins to cause a ruckus wherever they end up, but to challenge a dragon on its home turf and then start a war over cheese in a relatively short time span would certainly be considered impressive. Brayflox Alltalks has ever been seen as a firecracker of a woman, and her little settlement within the Longstop is a clear reflection of that personality. So it'll be interesting to see what else she and her forest gobbies get up to within the future. Whatever it is, one can only hope it doesn't set the forest ablaze. But until we find out, be mindful of the cheese, and stay safe, my friends. Thank you all for watching to the end. If you enjoyed this video, why not subscribe and share this with your fellow adventurers? With your help, I'll try to reach out even further and bring even greater stories to you. Although, I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge my biggest contributors. A grand thank you to Rovakis, Potato, Burn My Pancakes, The Yellow Couch, Papaya Cyan, Sage Mouse, Volvalis Oma, Cizane, and Cat, with an additional nod to the scholarships on screen. Links to things like my Twitter and that of my channel artist Caddy can be found in the description. Thank you all for your viewership as well as your support, and I hope all of you have a wonderful day. Class dismissed.